Hello, everyone, and welcome to this evening's Legacy program with Litvak and Jessica Shaw. I'm Gia Pace, Public Programs Coordinator at the Museum of Jewish Heritage, a living memorial to the Holocaust. Sal Litvak, who's joining us from LA, is many things: an award-winning filmmaker, social media influencer, and the accidental Talmudist. His work was inspired by a life-changing experience at a Jewish bookstore in 2005, after which Sal embarked on a quest to read the entire Babylonian Talmud and share his Jewish wisdom with the world. Sal is the son and grandson of Holocaust survivors who settled after the war in Santiago, Chile, where he was born. Jessica Shaw is the host of EW Live on Sirius XM and our gracious host this evening. If you have any questions or comments during the program, please feel free to share them in the Zoom chat at any time. Without further ado, welcome to you both, and take it away, Jessica.
Okay, thank you so much to Gia and everyone at the Museum of Jewish Heritage. I'm Jessica Shaw. I host EW Live on Sirius XM. I am so honored to be here with all of you to talk to someone whose story I find fascinating and whose life and passion and insights continue to inspire people of all ages, all backgrounds, all around the world. Salvador Litvak is a combo, like Gia said. He's a filmmaker, podcaster, blogger, teacher, student, Talmud studier. He's a Los Angelino by way of Chile and New York and Cambridge and a bunch of other cities. And he is the Accidental Talmudist, which counts over 1 million followers on Facebook. And as I'm sure you will find, if you aren't familiar with the website, accidentaltalmudist.com, you can read his posts, you can get his newsletter, watch videos, and so much more. I have so many questions for Sal, but I also love a good dinner party, and we're about to get 22 inches of snow. So let's just all, if you guys have questions, please write them in the chat over at the bottom of your Zoom window. And I just think this could be a really fun conversation. So definitely weigh in, and I will do my best to get to all of them. So Sal, first of all, welcome.
Thank you. I want to take you every time I do a talk. This is great.
Well, I since this program is about legacies, I was hoping to start by you telling us, even as Gia said, you were born in Chile, and I'm just curious when you first, and we're going to get to these different big moments in your life, but I'm just curious when you first identified, when you first realized you had a legacy as a Jew.
I first realized I had a legacy as a Jew. Jewish identity was always very important in our house. So it was just a given, and not only that, I have to say the Holocaust was a big thing in our house. My mother was in a camp as a baby. My grandmother carried her through. That was Theresienstadt. We'll get to that in the story. But my grandmother lost her husband. His picture was in several places in our house. If there was a Holocaust movie on TV, they were watching it. So it was always very present. We were members in a big conservative synagogue in New City, New York. I went to Hebrew school 3 days a week. And we had Shabbos dinners. So I guess it was just part of the fabric growing up.
Yeah. So tell me about, I would love to just hear you tell the story of your grandmother and of your mother and your grandfather, of course, and how they ended up from Hungary to Chile, and what happened to them during the Holocaust.
Okay, so my grandmother was born 1909 in Kartsag, Hungary. And let me see if I can manage this screen share. We have some pictures here that I can show. Share that. Okay, so this is, can people see that? That image is playing on the screen. So that's the Letterman family. My grandmother, do you see my cursor as well?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, okay. So the youngest girl here, that's my grandmother. Her name was Magda. This is her mother, Adele. They called her Adelka. in Hungary. This is her brother Imre, the other brother Shani, and her sister Lily. So this was a small town, and it was a farming community. I think there were a lot of Jews in the town. And as Magda was growing up, she developed a crush on this fellow right here. And his name was Imre. And this is him and his extended family. And he was the veterinarian of the town. So in an agricultural community, you can imagine the veterinarian was an important fellow. And, he was very, very, very well loved by the townspeople. If, some farmer needed an animal tended to and couldn't pay in money, maybe he was paying in eggs or chickens or something, he was always happy to take that. He was 10 years older than Magda. And eventually, when she was old enough, he took notice of her, and they fell in love and got married. And it was really one of those great love stories, one for the ages, as it were. And so, they were married in 1931, and then she became sort of his assistant in helping with the townspeople. And they were kind of like that couple that the town cared about, and they were having trouble having a child. So the years were going by, and she was not conceiving, not having a kid, so continuing to work when she'd rather be mothering, as it were. And meanwhile, Europe was becoming a very dark place, as we can all imagine. During the 1930s, the news was filtering in, even here, to rural Hungary. And 33, 34, 35, 36, I think sometime around 1936 or 37, Magda was reading in a newspaper that there was a need for veterinarians in another country that would be much more hospitable and safe for Jews to occupy. And she said to her husband, Imre, let's move to Iran. That's a good place to live. Europe is just not becoming a good place. What's going on there in Germany and this Hitler, et cetera. And his response to her was, I fought for my country in the Great War, meaning World War I. I'm a Hungarian. What do I know from Iran or Farsi? It's not my place. We're going to stay put. And that's what they did. And, the war years began. Things got worse and worse. But of course, Hungary was nominally an ally of Germany and was not invaded until relatively late in the war. And so the Jews, watched and heard what was going on to the Jews elsewhere, whatever news was possible to hear. And then amazingly enough, she finally got pregnant in 1943, of all times. And then shortly after that, he was taken away because he was actually an essential worker for the Nazis. Something that people don't often realize is that when you think of the Nazi war machine, you think of the tanks, the Blitzkrieg in Poland, et cetera, and the U-boats and ships and airplanes. But a lot of the actual occupying of Europe was just done by infantry, men on foot, with literally horse-drawn wagons, bringing the supplies. And as it got deeper and later into the war, they need a veterinarian to take care of their horses. But as it got later into the war, they ate their horses. The German soldiers were hungry. And at that point, they didn't need a veterinarian anymore. So Imre, and this is him a little bit older.
At that point.
Yeah, yeah. And so this is a little later. So this is Magda right there. And this is Imre, a little bit older. And this is, shortly before she got pregnant and he was taken away. And eventually he was taken to Dachau, and he never met his baby daughter, who was born in 1944. My mother was born May 1944. And it's just really one of those stories, literally, the way they would round up the Jews in these towns is there would be like an advance SS party, you know, whatever they were called. Some group of Nazis would come in, work with some local collaborators to identify all the Jews in a town. Then they got the list, and then they ordered the cattle cars, literally. And then they would round up all the Jews into some kind of holding area, sort of like a mini temporary ghetto. They rounded up all the Jews of Kartsag. And while they were rounded up and waiting for the train cars to arrive, Magda gave birth. So that was May 5th, 1944. They took her to like the local hospital, had the baby, back in the liquidation ghetto. And then, you know, like I don't know, a couple of days later, she's got the newborn in her arms, and they start putting everybody into two lines. They don't know what the lines mean, but everyone gets into two lines. And then what happened was that the whole family. Now, what's interesting about this picture, by the way, so here's Magda. Imre was already deported. These are the parents, Magda's parents, Adele and Shmuel. And then her brother Imre was in Budapest, and he was being hidden at this time by a non-Jewish girlfriend. Her sister Lily and her son Robert were in Budapest, and they were in hiding in various places. This is Lily's husband Tibor, and they actually managed to get through the war in hiding, and they survived also. In fact, all of them made it through the war eventually, although Samuel lived through the war, but was so ill that he died just a few weeks afterward. But at any rate, in those two lines in the town, the whole family, and there was much more extended family that was in the small town in Kartsag, where they were all from, were all on one line. But there was a cousin who was like 16 years old and who had a girlfriend who was on that other line. And so he just, went over to be with the girlfriend. And then his parents went with him and other relatives went with them. And then they said, come with us, let's all stay together. My grandmother had this newborn baby, and there was actually a German soldier that took pity on her and said to her, I think he actually got her some milk or some food for her to eat so she could keep up her milk, and told her, stay in this line. Mm. And it meant something to her. And so when the whole family went to that other line and summoned her, she said, I'm staying here. So she stayed there with her baby, and her mother and her father stayed with her. So as you can imagine, everyone who went to that other line went straight to Auschwitz. And somehow this woman with a newborn and her older parents were able to stay in the line that was for farm workers. They actually got taken to be slave labor on a farm. Like I said, the Nazis were hungry, and they were harvesting crops on farms in Hungary that summer of 1944. Then in the fall, once the harvest was done, they didn't need those workers anymore, and then they were sent to Theresienstadt. And so there, my mother, as an infant, ended up being one of something like 100 children that survived that concentration camp. Somehow my grandmother kept her alive, would just eat anything to keep up her milk. Her parents, one of the reasons that her father ended up being so weak, my mother's grandfather, is because he gave half of his food to his daughter. And in the end, it was just really the three women who survived, 3 generations: Adele, my grandmother Magda, and my mother Kati. Her name's Kati.
And then how did they end up in Chile?
So after the war, they were in Hungary. They just went back to what they knew. Mm-hmm. So they were, and then in Budapest, because Lily was there, the sister who had survived during the war. And then this brother, Imre, same name as my grandfather who had perished, he followed an opportunity to Chile. Some Hungarian Jew went to Chile following some business opportunity, and he went also. And he was a lawyer by training, very, very smart man. But it was one of those stories where he literally bought the deed to an iron mine in a bar in Santiago, Chile.
As one does.
And you would think that, poor schmuck from Europe, the last you ever heard of him. But it was real. And so he started pulling iron out of the mountains by donkey train. And eventually the donkeys gave way to trucks, and the trucks to bigger trucks. And he did very well for himself. And then, and he made it his mission to get his family out of Europe, which, as the Soviet curtain, sort of came down, it became very difficult to do. But finally, in 1956, he got his sisters out. His mother did not survive. She died in 1951. But my grandmother, Magda, and by then my mother, who was 12 years old and had grown up in Soviet Hungary, were transplanted to Chile.
I'm so curious what it was like for you growing up. My father was a child. He escaped Paris during the war. He was 5 years old, and he and his family were able to flee and get out. And he grew up in Cuba. And I know just from my own childhood, and it's interesting because this next generation, my children, don't necessarily have the same experience. I had so many relatives who were survivors, and it was always interesting who was able to talk about their memories or talk about things and who didn't. I mean, I can tell you, my father was very young, but he didn't talk a lot about that escape or anything. And I was curious what it was like for you in your childhood, because your grandmother lived with you, right?
Yes. So my grandmother always lived with us. And like I was saying earlier, the Holocaust was very present in our house, but it's same as what you're saying. She didn't talk about it. She didn't talk about it. It was just part of the fabric of our family life that, my grandfather had been murdered by the Nazis, and you don't buy a German car or any other German product. But they didn't talk about it. If there was a Holocaust movie on, my mother and my grandmother sat there watching it, weeping. And I almost always felt like, it's almost like there's much more institutional awareness of the Holocaust now. There's museums and, so much has been built up. But somehow when I was growing up, I felt like, well, I don't need to learn anything more about the Holocaust. I know it's in the house. I don't have to watch these movies. I know. I'm sure it's just the arrogance of youth. But it was that much part of the fabric of our home life.
And what about with your mother? Did she, obviously she didn't have memories, but how was that? Did you feel, certainly many people have written so much about being the child of a survivor, but did you feel that from her too, that kind of existed with her, that she was a survivor and that her mother was?
Yeah. And there was this sense, my wife Nina and I wrote and I directed a movie called When Do We Eat, which is a dysfunctional family comedy about a Passover Seder. But there's lots of elements in that movie that come from our background. And there's a grandfather, played by Jack Klugman, who takes a suitcase everywhere he goes because you never know. And so there were certain aspects of that, first of all, no matter what country you were in, you might have to leave. My mother was on her third country. You always had to have a current passport. For my grandmother, so we had, kitchen cabinets filled with food. We had a pantry closet filled with food. And in the garage, there was a wall of shelves filled with food because you never know. And it was amazing. Like if there was a gap on those shelves filled with food, off she went. She never got a driver's license, but where I grew up in New City, New York, the supermarket was like 2 hours away. 2 miles away. And she had like one of those push carts. And off she'd go.
In our family.
What's that?
We called them a vegele in Yiddish.
Yeah. So there were all these sort of, habits and practices that were clearly from that time, and we all understood where they came from.
Right. And it's so interesting because I imagine, I don't know, you tell me, as a young child, that's just your reality. And it takes, I don't know, some time to really step back and have the perspective to say, oh, okay, this is why we have 75 cans of tomatoes in the garage.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah.
Just so. Just so.
Yeah.
Right. And it's interesting, like the way growing up could have been. Here, I'll share my screen again. Right. So this is when this is when we left Chile. Right. So I was about 5 years old. That's my mom. She's actually pregnant with my brother, who was born shortly after we arrived in the United States. And that's my grandmother as I knew her, Magda. What's that name? Oh, yeah. And so we moved to the United States, but we were actually on our way to Australia. My father had received a job offer, and there was opportunities for young professionals in Australia. They actually made it very attractive for young professionals to move to Australia. Now, it was nice for us in Chile. The life for the Jews in Chile was very nice. But in 1970, Salvador Allende got elected, and he was a communist. And so for the Hungarians, like, yeah, we've seen this movie before. We know how it ends. We leave, right? Yeah. So that idea of, once you've been a refugee, it's always in your blood. And so you might have to seek refuge again. So they were on their way to Australia, but the uncle, Americo, we called him Americo, the Spanish version of Imre, he had moved to Spain. Now his sister was on her way to Australia. It's going to be too far away. They're citizens of the world, but that's too far.
Right.
And so he said to my parents, please check out New York. I have a good friend there. And so he knew this fellow, Paul Soros, who's actually George Soros' brother, the famous George Soros. It's his brother. But Paul, very different kind of guy, owned a major engineering firm. My dad was an engineer. That was another thing. You have to be educated. You have to have a professional degree, because if you have to go to another country, then if you have the education, you can get started there, right? So my mother had a degree in chemistry and in pharmacy. My father was an engineer, which is a profession you can practice anywhere in the world. And so my uncle said to my father, please meet this guy, Paul Soros, in New York. Maybe you'll get along. So we just stopped in New York for a few weeks to check it out. We ended up staying, but an amazing story from that period is, so my father, who does he know in the United States? Not so many people, but from the engineering school in Chile, he was given an introduction to an engineering professor at Columbia. So we're like staying in a hotel in Manhattan. He's taking the subway up to meet this professor at Columbia. He misses the stop, but looks at the subway map and says, oh, I'll just get off at the next stop and walk through this park near Columbia in 1970, which I guess is Morningside Park, and not the safest of places at any time, and certainly not in 1970. So he's walking through the park with all the money that we have in the world in his pocket. And he got mugged. And it was like two kids, accosted him, and one in front, one behind, and they put a knife to his neck, but he literally saw the knife as it was coming into his neck. It was like a butter knife, like a table knife. And he was young, and he'd been a rugby player in college. He was carrying an umbrella, and without really thinking, he, kicked the guy in the privates in front of him. And he took the umbrella and hit the guy in the neck behind him and ran, and he made it to the professor's office at Columbia. And then, he started like shaking violently that he had escaped this. So it's almost miraculous that we stayed in New York.
Right.
But yeah, he started working with Paul Soros, and then we stayed.
Right. So I wanted to, the story of how you became, or eventually what was like the big stepping stones toward you becoming the Accidental Talmudist, which is, as many people know you now, is an extraordinary story, involving the passing of your grandmother Magda, who you were just talking about. And I was wondering if you could tell people about that moment, because it really leads us to where you are today.
Sure. Okay, so as I mentioned that a couple of times, my grandfather's picture was in our house in several places. Now, my grandmother, right after the war, she didn't go immediately back to Budapest. She was in a displaced persons camp. And if you read stories about these DP camps, amazing stories came out of there. So many people lost their spouses, lost their children. I mean, unimaginable tragedy. And then in the DP camp, it's like they got into the business of repopulating the world with Jews. And there were weddings every day in those DP camps. And my grandmother went to many of them and sang and danced and was rejoicing and happy for the people that were sort of starting over. But for her, there was only her husband, Imre. It's just, like I said, one of those love stories for the ages. And so growing up with her in our home, it's just understood that I called her Ita, which is short for abuelita. In Spanish, it was too big a word for me when I was little. And it was just understood that Ita was waiting to be reunited with her husband, Imre, when she left this world. Her faith was very strong. We were not religious Jews at all. I went to Hebrew school, but like only until I had bar mitzvah, and then I was done. I found Judaism tragically for me boring. I just wasn't into it. I was like a very, very strong identity as a Jew, cultural Jew, but not into Judaism at all. But spiritually, I'm sure this always influenced me that she was waiting to be reunited with her husband in the next world. And so she never went on a date. She never was interested. She was just, waiting. So I grew up, like I said, after my bar mitzvah, I did youth group and stuff, but that was really just a party with my friends. And spiritually, I was always very interested in that upper world. So I didn't go exploring other religions, but I was always interested in other practices that were spiritual. And so over time, here, I'm going to just share this little picture here. Like when I was in college, I was on the rowing team. And rowing is the sport.
I'm going to Jewish mother you for a second and just say he went to Harvard. Carry on.
Yes, I did. That was my parents' dream and mine. And when I got in, it was like we all got into Harvard. Again, because if you have a good education, no matter what country you end up in, it's of value. So yeah, when I was at Harvard, I was interested in literature that would somehow about that sense of other, that spiritual realm. Rowing, to sport, I did it all 4 years, hours and hours every day. But there were moments when that boat would have what was called swing, which is when all of us were perfectly synchronized, like breath, oars, seats, everything. And sometimes you would just touch that. You felt like you touched that other world. It was more than just guys rowing together. I got into meditation while I was there. Over time, I got into Grateful Dead shows, into martial arts, into drumming, always looking for that touch of that higher world. I eventually, I went to law school, but I just to get that professional degree, but I realized that being a lawyer wasn't for me. A friend of mine went to film school. That's the first time it got on my radar. I ended up coming out to LA to go to UCLA Film School in the director's program. And, just learning and interested in telling stories that would have some bearing on that upper world. And time passed, and eventually it was 1997. And I got the call that it was the end. My grandmother had a skin cancer that metastasized, spread through her body. She was 89 years old. It was slow developing, but the end came. So I flew back to my parents' house. At that time, they were living in Bethesda, Maryland. And when I got home, she was in hospice care, totally emaciated, had lost consciousness. She was always a small and kind of thin woman. And now she probably weighed like 70 or 80 pounds. as you can imagine. She was lying on a bed, and you can imagine, I'm like in my chair here, and the bed was right here, and then kind of kneeling on the floor, holding her hands. Right next to me was my mom and my brother next to her, and my father kind of at the foot of the bed. And she was having those rasping, labored breaths. And then she took her last breath. And if you've been in the room with somebody who died, a person just died in the same room with you. And we were all crying and telling her, we love you and you're going to a good place. And my mom like really cried with tremendous emotion and tore our clothes. But something pulled my attention away from her face and to the middle of the room. And I'm going to share this thing here. Okay, this is not what it looked like, but it's sort of an image to give you some kind of an impression of what I was seeing. It was like something in the middle of the room the air started to shimmer, and it was like there was lights in it, so a little bit like this illustration here. And then something opened in the middle of the room as I was looking, and then I saw my grandmother. Not as she lay sick on the bed, but as I knew her, this very charming, and by the way, she sounds saintly, but she was really funny. We had a great time. We always hung out and made each other laugh. But she was moving away from me and moving towards someone. And then I recognized from all those photographs in our house, my grandfather Imre. And I'm like, oh my God, I'm seeing this moment that she's been waiting 53 years for. And the weird thing is, she didn't want to go. It was like she was reluctant, like when you drag a puppy across the kitchen floor. And I'm like, why wouldn't she want to go? She's been waiting for this so long. And then I got it. He was young, like the last time she saw him in 1943. And she's an old lady. And she's like, oh, he's not going to want me. He reached out, pulled her to him. They embraced. It got brighter. Then she was young again, like the last time they were together. Then they were embracing and kissing. And then it got super bright. And then they were gone. And my mom and my brother are still crying and holding her hand. And I'm like, just stunned, with this smile on my face, because with her last moment in this world, she gave me this glimpse beyond the veil. And when I got back to LA, it's like, I didn't know what to do with that, but I wanted to honor her. I went to a synagogue to say Kaddish, similar type of synagogue to the one I'd grown up in. And then I realized that this thing that I'd been looking for in all these other practices, so maybe I should try looking for spirituality in my own backyard in Judaism. And actually the rabbi of that synagogue is David Wolpe, quite a famous rabbi, and a gifted teacher. And the music at that synagogue was very beautiful. And then I was very, very moved that day. And I thought, I got to give this a try. And I started learning and going to shul and taking classes. And we're very fortunate in LA. There's many great and gifted teachers here. A fellow named Schwartzy, Rabbi Shlomo Schwartz, very famous in LA, became a dear friend, and other great rabbis. And every rabbi that I took a class from, sooner or later, and usually sooner, would mention the Talmud. And I thought, okay, well, clearly this Talmud is full of wisdom. And, I'm coming to Judaism so late with any kind of rigor that I'd like to know what's in that Talmud. I need to know what's in that Talmud. It's clearly full of wisdom. But then when I would go to this Judaica store, bookstore, and also, just to get gifts or a kippah or a talis or something, on Pico Boulevard in LA. So they had the Talmud there. And the Talmud, if I'm sure some of our viewers are older and remember the Encyclopedia Britannica. Okay, so that's the knowledge of humanity in 23 burgundy volumes, right? So the Art Scroll Talmud, the volumes are every big and weighty as Britannica, but the knowledge of the Jews is 73 volumes. It's just so big and so inaccessible that every time I thought about, opening or buying a volume, I said, this is ridiculous. I didn't go to yeshiva, maybe in the next lifetime. I mean, this is too much for me. And I would walk away, repeat a dozen times. But then once, it was 2005, right? So about 8 years after, or 7.5 years after her death, and I'd, taken enough classes and been in that bookstore so many times. And then I just thought, I was in there one day, I went through that same thought process. I guess it's not for me. And I said, stop. I went to Harvard. I was an English major. I went to law school. I went to film school. Nina and I are bibliophiles. Our house is full of books. Why am I backing down from books? There must be a book one of the Talmud. I'll just get that, see what it's like. I found book one. I took it to the counter, and hold on. This fellow, Zach Plotzker, was at the register, and he said to me, "You're doing DaFiomi." And I said, "What's DaFiomi?" And he looked at me really funny. He went like this. His glasses, as if to say, are you kidding? And so I thought, oh man, DaFiomi must be a code. If you don't know the code, you're not allowed to read the book. They must just be for rabbis, or you have to be 40 or 50, or you have to have a beard, you have to be Orthodox, who knows? But clearly I'm not supposed to have the book, and now he's got to get rid of me without embarrassing me. This is so awkward. Oh, how do I get out of here? And Zach said, DaFiomi is a program where everyone around the world reads the entire Talmud on the same schedule. DaFiomi means page of the day. So it's 1 page a day. And to read the whole Talmud, 1 page a day, takes 7.5 years.
I want to just stop you for 1 second, because I want to just reiterate what you just said, because I find it really fascinating. With DaFiomi, every Jew or whoever's reading it around the world is reading the same thing every day. I don't know how many people around the world, maybe tens of thousands of people, are doing the same thing over these 7.5 years.
Yes.
Karen. Okay.
Right. And that was the idea of I can't remember his name right now, but the rabbi who invented it, I think in 1923, this cycle. So exactly. So somebody who's studying Talmud in New York, and he goes on a trip to Moscow, there's going to be a group studying the same page as him, and he can come right in that class. And so it takes 7.5 years to read the whole Talmud. And today, said Zach Plotzker, is day one. So I happened to buy book one of the Talmud on day one of a 7.5 year cycle. Listen, it would have been amazing if I had bought book one on the second day or the third day or the 10th day of a 7.5 year cycle of 2,711 days. I could have walked in, and God put that book in my hand on day one of the cycles.
Okay,
so I got the message.
Where was your first day? Where did you study DaFiomi the first day? It was not a pandemic then. You didn't have to be on Zoom. You didn't even know
Right.
what Zoom was then.
What did I do? I went home. First of all, I read the page. So it's Brachas. Brachas is the first volume of the Talmud, and then the first teaching of the 73 volumes is until or from what time in the evening do we say the evening Shema? And it depends on when the priest would come in to eat the food that's only set aside for the priest. And there was a family and his sons, and they were asking, it's a story from the Talmud. But one thing I ascertained quickly, there wasn't internet already, is that you're not supposed to study Talmud alone. So I said, okay, well, where's a class I can go learn? I said, all right. First of all, I looked up, there's 3 kinds of DaFiomi classes. DaFiomi is taught in Yiddish, in Hebrew, or in English. Okay, so I'm going to English. So the English DaFiomi class is going to be taught at Eula Boys High School at 9 p.m. this evening. So I'm like, oh, okay, I'm going to go check that out. So this is I think I went on like the second or third day. The first 3 days I just read by myself. Then I go to this class, And the rabbi walks in, and the other students are there, and they're not using the art scroll with the English translation. They've all just got only Hebrew and Aramaic in their book. And the rabbi starts talking, and it's ostensibly in English, but every other word from his mouth is either Hebrew or Aramaic. And I had no idea what he was talking about. I couldn't follow it at all. And I realized that I would have to read my whole page, which takes about an hour, and then come to the class, which would be 2 hours. And at the time I was editing that film, When Do We Eat? I mean, I was way too busy for a 2 hour a day, 7 days a week commitment. So I just said, I'll do it by myself with Rabbi Art Scroll. And the Art Scroll editors really did an incredible job. You're not just reading it, it's being taught to you out of that book. And for the next 3 years, I did it by myself. It's literally an hour a day, every day. Yom Kippur, you do your daf. You're getting married, you do your daf. You're sick, you do your daf. You're in the hospital, you do your daf. You're on a trip, you do your daf. You have to do it every day. And always knowing I'm not supposed to be doing it alone, but I couldn't go to that class. Then we moved to the neighborhood we live in now, 2007 in Hancock Park in Los Angeles. And I read that there's another class near me. I said, well, maybe I'll try that. And I went, and this was taught by Rabbi Mechi Blau in English, but again, every other word in Hebrew, Aramaic. But 3 years into it, I could follow it, so I had picked up enough of that jargon, and it was really a joy. And then to finish the story, I stayed with it for the 7.5 years. In 2012, I went to the Siyum Hashas, the completion. I did it while I was directing on the side of When to Eat. And then in 2012, I went to MetLife Stadium in August 2012. There were 93,000 Jews there, all of them wearing black hats. One of them had a white hat. That was me. In this incredible celebration. Not everybody there had completed the 7.5 year journey. Probably 10% of the people had. But all 93,000 were dancing a hora that lasted 20 minutes. And I could not help but think about those Nazis who filled stadiums to celebrate that they were going to burn our books and burn the Jews. And those bastards were gone from this world. And here we were, 93,000 strong, celebrating an unbroken tradition stretching back 3,000 years to Mount Sinai.
Yeah. First of all, thank you to Aaron Oppenheim, who said it's Rabbi Meir Shapiro of Litvak Yeshiva, who founded DaFiomi in 1923. I was going to ask you, because you've written about that, about being at, I'm going to just go old school and call it Giant Stadium, because that's how I grew up.
Yes.
With 93,000 people for Siyum Hashas. It's interesting to me, even when you write about it, and just now when you talked about it, that it's linked in your mind, that you couldn't help but think of the Nazi stadiums. It's interesting that what the legacy of your family surviving the Holocaust, and how that continues to inform your thoughts and how you view your connection to Judaism or your connection to Talmud today.
Yeah. Sometimes you think, well, if people survived, is that heroic? They just preserve their lives? What's heroic about that? It wouldn't be heroic if all they did is preserve their own life. But because there's a Jewish mission that we've all been given, that stretches back 3,300 years, right, to make this place a fitting home for God and for the goodness that God wants in this world. So then we're not just surviving to preserve our own lives. We're surviving to share this light with the world, and we're all entrusted with it. And we all have obligations. I mean, we're obligated. We have to keep Shabbos. We should wrap tefillin. Women should light candles, etc. And we didn't sign on a dotted line that we agreed to be obligated in those things, but we are. We were just entrusted with, and the reason we're obligated in those things is because there is a mission. And so surviving is a heroic act so that we can keep it going. I mean, I'm a filmmaker. That I'm certainly never imagined that I would be some kind of professional Jew. But as that siyum was approaching, that celebration, I thought I should tell my story because I got so much out of, studying Talmud every day and really understanding what the laws are and where we come from and the legends and the folklore and the thinking and the logic. I said I should share my story because maybe somebody else, who would never pick up the Talmud, just like I had been, I never would have picked it up if God hadn't literally thrust it in my hands with such an incredible coincidence. I said, if I tell my story, maybe somebody else would try it. I called my buddy David Suissa, editor of the Jewish Journal here in LA. He was a big fan of When to Eat. That's how we met. And I said, let's have lunch. Took him to lunch. I told him this story. I said, if I wrote that up, would you publish it? And David's so funny. He said, that's a cover story for the Jewish Journal. But you should, it's more than that. So you should write a blog for the Jewish Journal to talk about what you're learning, not just how you fell into it. So Accidental Talmudist started as a cover story and as a blog at the Jewish Journal. And then if you have a blog, you should promote it with a Facebook page. And so we started a Facebook page called Accidental Talmudist. And I like Facebook because unlike the weekly blog, 800 words, on Facebook, one day you just share a little wisdom. The next day you have a live show, a live video. The next day, a little video, then a long, whatever. It's like whatever you want to share that day. And that's more like my personality. And against all odds, I never expected in any way it grew. And Nina and I do everything together. And, she writes these Thursday hero stories, and we did live videos, and we share wisdom of the sages, and we share classic Jewish jokes. We share Holocaust stories for sure, especially hero stories from the Holocaust, people who saved Jews, Jews who saved Jews, non-Jews who saved Jews. And this thing just grew and grew and grew. And today we have 1 million followers around the world.
Over 1 million. I'm curious, what was the moment where you knew, so you had the blog going and the Jewish Journal column. What was the moment that you knew that you had tapped into something? Because there are so many different kinds of people that feel connected to you and what you're saying. Was there a specific moment where you thought, oh, okay, this is something big or meaningful to a big group?
Right. I mean, like when right, those are different questions. Like when we knew it was working and like it was gathering, because as filmmakers, we're so interested in audience, of course, like we notice when an audience is forming around something. So it's really when we got the 10,000 follower, like, wow, 10,000 followers, it's amazing. And we highlighted that person. And then when we got the 20,000 follower, we highlighted that person. And we did that up until 100,000, and then it was just growing too fast. And but when we knew that it was special, that it wasn't just numbers, but that it was touching people, is because we started getting letters. We started getting letters about how much it meant to people. I mean, we're communicators, we're entertainers. So maybe what's a little different about our page is it's not just accessible, but we don't dumb it down. But we just have a nose for what's, what has entertainment value. I hate to use that word, Jewish wisdom and Jewish history, but we understand what's compelling, what is narratively compelling. So we were just touching people, and we kept getting like unsolicited letters. And what was really interesting was that they weren't all from Jews at all. In fact, I would say that the majority of the 1 million people who follow us are not Jewish. Probably 40% Jewish, 60% not. Of the 60% not Jewish.
What do you think that 60%, what drew them to this?
A lot of them are Christian, and their guy is Jewish, right? Jesus was Jewish. So they're very interested in the life of the man at the center of their religion. That's one thing. There's also a lot of people of faith who take the Bible seriously, take seriously God's words and those who bless you, I shall bless, right? And so they have a relationship with Israel and the Jewish people, which is very sincere and very warm. And what's great about our page is there's no proselytizing going on. We're not trying to make them Jewish. They're not trying to make us Christian. We're just learning together, right? And sharing this authentic, unbroken chain of wisdom that stretches back many years. And then also we have tons of followers in Pakistan and in India, in Nigeria, like very unexpected places in Egypt. Again, because we're just sharing authentic wisdom in a way that people can tap into.
Yeah, I want to ask a couple of questions. There are so many interesting questions coming in. Ida Martinez said, what do you think a non-religious Jew can get from studying Talmud? And I think in addition, even among the 40% who are Jewish, I would venture to guess many of them are not religious.
Absolutely. Yeah, hundreds of thousands. And I identify with them so strongly because I was me before I had that experience at my grandmother's bedside. So there's just so much to learn. I mean, look, a classic teaching, right, as Ben Zoma says, who is wise? One who learns from every person. Who is rich? This is the one that's usually quoted. One who is content with what he has. What are the other ones? Who is honored? One who honors others. And who is strong? This is great. Who is strong? One who masters his own inclinations, right? And when you put that kind of thinking, I mean, I don't think anyone would argue that the Jews contain within their population some smart people. We've just valorized education and thinking and logical thinking for so long. And we've been persecuted so hard for thousands of years that that's a kind of evolutionary pressure to, that the people who are smart enough to survive are the ones who survive and, pass on the genes. So you've got very smart people adding to a reservoir of wisdom of how to lead a meaningful life for thousands of years. I mean, that reservoir gets deep, and everyone, any human being can benefit from the wisdom in that reservoir.
Patty asked, how did studying Talmud with men only influence you, or did it? And I would just tack onto that question, to Patty's excellent question about how you kind of reconcile that there might be some things that don't maybe fit with contemporary beliefs.
Sure. Look, this is the Talmud was set down 2,000 years ago in an extremely patriarchal society. And so you see it all the time. There's not many women mentioned in the Talmud. Interestingly, the women who are mentioned there are not just talked about as, homemakers. There's actually women like Breweria, Rabbi Meir's wife, who is considered a paragon of wisdom, and that all the sages should strive to have as big a brain and as big a capacity to learn as her. Ima Shalom is another one. So the rabbis had tremendous respect for women. And you see that it was written in a patriarchal society, but in the midst of a patriarchal world. And the Jewish tradition actually gave many more rights to women than women in the surrounding cultures had ever dreamed of. Nevertheless, you have to, be able to identify, what is then and what is now, and understand what was being taught in that context and how it might be applied in the modern context. I did learn when I would go to, my DaFiomi shiur every day with just men. That's true. But since the news cycle began last year in 2020, January 5th, 2020, I've been teaching a daily Talmud class at 6 p.m., actually 6 p.m. Pacific, 9 p.m. Eastern every day, except Fridays at noon Pacific and Saturdays a couple hours after Shabbos ends. And we get about 3,000 views a day. And that class has more women in it than men, for sure. And we definitely are a community. In fact, Accidental Talmudist is not a person. Accidental Talmudist is a community. And the whole idea is that, I stumbled into this, I found it valuable, and so I share what I have learned. And if you learn something from us and you find it valuable, please share it with others. And so it's very much a strong community. And, I love learning with the women in our daily class. They bring such amazing insights.
That's wonderful. We only have time for one more question. I feel like I could talk to you for hours. We only have time for one more. And I just wanted to ask, I guess now that you are, two-part question. One, when is the next DaFiomi cycle starting over? I know someone asked that a few questions ago, and I want to make sure that I get that answered for her or for him. But also, I'm curious for you, what's it like doing this the second time around? Do you feel like you have does it feel different to you doing DaFiomi for the second time?
It definitely feels different. And it is the second time, right? There's been 3 cycles since I stumbled into it in 1997, right? So then I'm sorry, in 2000. She died in 1997. It turns out she died, I think, like on the day or a day away from that cycle turning over. I never knew that. 2005, I fell into it. 2012, I went to the completion. 2012 to 2020, I wasn't doing DaFiomi, but I was building the Accidental Talmudist community. And then January 5th, 2020, started teaching the daily class. And so now I'm going through the second time, and it's completely different, learning something in order to teach it every day. It's a much deeper level than just learning it, as it were. But what I would say to people is don't wait until 2027 when the next cycle renews. You can jump in at any time. The Talmud is not a novel where if you miss the beginning, you'll be lost. You'll be lost wherever you start. but after a few days or weeks or months, like it'll start to come in. And if you learn with me, I never say something in Hebrew that I don't translate into English immediately. I always try. I don't teach the whole page. I teach highlights of the page and how it connects to something that we can all, understand, care about, and apply in the modern world.
Absolutely. Everyone should go check out accidentaltalmudist.com. I love what
.org.
Sorry,
I think it'll go there anyway, but it's accidentaltalmudist.org.
Okay, .org.
Yeah.
I love, Sal, what you just said about it being a community, that it's not a person. This isn't you, that this is this community, 1 million plus strong. So I want to thank you so much for your time tonight. It's been a wonderful conversation. I love hearing just how different things in someone's life and the legacy of someone's family and how that informed who you are today. So I want to thank you so much and thank everyone, all of you who joined us tonight. Everyone, please continue to stay safe and stay warm. Except for Sal, he's in Los Angeles, so he doesn't have to.
Oh, it's cold here. It's under 60.
Okay, Sal, please. And thank you to Gia and to the Museum of Jewish Heritage. And once again, Sal Litvak, thank you so much.
And thank you, Jessica, and thank you to the museum.